Hello internet, my name is Zori and welcome to I spent $50 on a craft box to keep myself sane in 2020. Alright, so if you don't know, this is a Sophie and Toffee box, which is usually resin related. Sometimes they do other things, and every month they have a new theme. This is the third one I've gotten, and I've been pretty happy with the contents. If you're wondering why I didn't make a video on the other two, it's because I wasn't sure how interesting it would be just to watch me follow directions. But with this one, I feel like it's more open in what you can get out of it, so I've got two projects planned. One just from the box's contents, and one with a mixture of stuff. So here's what's in the box. First off is the pamphlet that tells you what you get. Looks like some gloves and a silicone knife, always useful. Then we have one giant seashell and two packages of 2-part resin. I have the premium box, by the way. Then we got a little easel, a mixed bag of small seashells, a little container of sand, some plastic measuring cups, a wood board. Mine has a little split in it, but it's okay. Then we have a big round piece of wood, some faux moss, 2 sizes of bezel tape, and some rainbow glitter, or hollow. Some more plastic cups, and 4 ocean-themed pigments. I'm pretty happy with the stuff, though I would have been happier if we'd have gotten just one silicone cup instead of these plastic ones, but that's just a nitpick. Okay, so here's the first project I plan on making. It's inspired from this video on their website by Sandrates. I'm not going to follow her perfectly, which means it will probably not look as good, but I want to make a seashell tree. But before that, we have to resin the biggest seashells together. Now I know I said I was going to just use the things that came in the box, but there's no way I could do this without something quick drying, and it would take forever if I had to do this with 2-part resin, so I'll be using UV resin for the craft. She does the same in her video. Okay, next step is to pick out a few shells to make into your platforms. This is a mixed bag of shells, so if you have this box, you most likely won't have the same shells. I ended up using this broken one for the top and these kind of smaller ones for the side, but first I decided to make my seashell tree. I saw this and I just had to. In hindsight, I think I should have just super glued the moss on, because trying to hold it while I was curing the UV resin was kind of a pain. Also, I want to talk about this moss for a second, because this stuff feels real. The first time I touched it, I jumped because of how real it felt. If I ever become Mr. Beast, I'm gonna make myself a bed out of this stuff. It would be amazing. But look, here's my tree. It's pretty simple to make. All you have to do is glue the moss on. I think it turned out pretty awesome. But before I glue it on, I glued the top shell on and some toothpicks to the bottom for stabilization. I was going to glue on the others too, but I figured it was best to glue on the tree first so I could see where the other shells should go. But after all of those are glued on, I take some sand and add it to the top shell, which just ends up getting covered by the water resin, so don't do this. But do add sand to the outer rim. I think it adds a cool texture, and if I were to do this again, I would have added sand to the entire bottom. That way I wouldn't have a specific place to make my water line. Also, I do add another little shell. I was gonna make this into a little bush, but I figured it would be too much green, so I just leave it plain. I do add a little green to the sides to cover up where the big shell's meet, because that looks a little raw edged. Also, I'm sorry about the bad camera angles. I definitely have to start figuring out a better place to put my camera. Technical issues aside, it's time to mix up the resin colors, and hot damn, these pigments are amazing. All I do is poke a toothpick through the foil and just a little bit is way darker than I meant it to be. I wonder if they have all the colors. They don't, but this set of 4 is only like $5 and I would 100% recommend these bottles. I will never need another blue again. But back to the project, I pour a very thin layer of the dark blue in the bottom of each of the shells and cure them before adding the next layer, which turned out to be so pigmented that you can't even see the dark blue in the smaller shells. And if you try this, I would suggest taking the darker blue up the ridges of the big shell. I think it would have made it look more fanciful, but this light blue was so thick that it works out anyway. So for the next layer, I use the same cup my light blue was in and add some more clear UV resin just to tint it. And then I add some of these hollow glitters to give it a fun sparkle. Just like with the pigment, less is more. Also, remember when you're pouring this layer, make it thin. Even clear UV resin does some weird stuff if it's in a too thick of a layer. You can't see it on camera very well, but a bubble did form in the bigger part of the ocean. So after curing this layer, it's time to add the wave layer. How you do this depends on how thick you want your foam to be. I wanted a very wispy look, so I added a clear layer of resin to the bottom and then mixed up some white and poured thin lines where I thought waves would be, and then I blew them around with a straw. You could use a heat gun for this, but I find I have better control with a straw, so in small pieces like this or those beach earrings I made, I find straws just easier to use. Now I also add a little bit of white to the shell where the water would be the most turbulent, like where it would be splashing into the next shell. Speaking of that, all you have to do to make flowing water is to make thin lines of resin on a piece of parchment paper. Don't worry about making them a perfect size, they're very easy to cut. Then all you have to do is cure them and then glue them into the place where the water would pour over the side. And boom, you could be done here or add another thin layer of resin just to smooth things out. I choose not to, but I do decide to glue rocks to the bottom so it sits nicer. And it turned out pretty cool. I think I'm going to give this one to my grandma. The wave layer seems to hide this big air pocket nicely. And the stones look better than the toothpicks I had glued to the bottom. I like how mine looks different than hers. It makes me feel a little better about using her idea, but now it's time for the big project, and by big, I just mean it takes longer. In reality, it's very easy. I've made a few other beach projects that are very similar to how I make this, with the added difficulty of me wanting to make it a planter. I got this small clay pot at Walmart for like 50 cents on sale, and I'm using the circle piece of wood that came in the box. And I wanted the planter to sit in the wood so you could still drain the water out of the planter if you wanted to use real plants. And I'm gonna tell you what, I did not have the proper tools to cut a hole in this thick of a board. All I have is a Dremel, and maybe I'm just dumb, but it took me forever to get a hole in this, and it's horribly uneven, but that's okay because it's gonna be covered up with sand. So after that horrible struggle that took me forever, you can glue your planter in. I use UV resin just to make sure it's sealed nicely around the edges. If you're better at cutting than me, you probably won't even have to glue it in. But after all that's cured, it's time to tape around the edges of the wood. It doesn't have to be too high, you only want a light layer of sand to cover your bottom. And then you can mix up the 2-part resin. On a side note, this is my first time using Sophie and Toffee's 2-part resin, and it doesn't smell at all. If they didn't take 40 years to ship to me, I would definitely consider making this my main resin. But after thoroughly mixing your epoxy, you can mix it with the sand of your choice. And I use a little bit of the hollow glitter that came in this box. Now I used all the resin in these bottles just for the sand part. Sand will eat up your resin. Honestly, this whole project is very resin intensive. I end up using 3 of these. Also, pro tip, maybe measure how much sand you want around the base of this because I end up making a little too much. Plus, the less sand you have on your base, the higher your water can be, which looks better for the fish we're going to be putting in here. Also, I build up my extra sand around my planter so it looks like it's on a little island. I end up adding a little too much resin. But I decided to add some of the shells, and I was going to add some bigger stones, but I forgot. And then we get to play the best game, the waiting game. Legit, the worst thing about 2-part resin is having to wait. You do not have to wait until it's fully cured before you add your next layer, unless you do this before you go to bed and then you have to work in the morning and then you eat dinner when you come home, and by that time it's been like 20 hours. This stuff was probably good to add the next layer after 8 hours, so it shouldn't take you 4 days to make this like it did for me. But after coming home from work, it's time to clean up the resin that spilled all over the place. Thank the gods that nothing ended up on the floor. I end up putting this in a plastic bin for the next couple of layers, just in case. But first I add the larger tape around the side of the pond, and in this step, try to make your tape as smooth as possible. You will see the tape makes little indents in my resin, and there's not a whole lot you can do to fix it. You'll see some of my mistakes later, but first let's add one of these clear little fish stickers and some seaweed, which is just the fake moss. Also, I decided to tint this layer with a little bit of dark blue, and by a little, I mean just the tip of the toothpick. I cannot get over how pigmented this pigment is. But after waiting another workday for this layer to cure, I add a few more fish and another thin layer of resin. And then, after, you guessed it, another day of work, I take off the tape to see if I like the height of my water, and here you could see where the tape has created some divots in my resin. And I should have put the seaweed in the sand level, because I mean, that's where the seaweed would grow, but also because it's now sticking up over the water a little too far. So I go ahead and add another thin layer of resin, so I don't need to tape around the edge again. Resin's usually pretty good about staying where you want it if you're not trying to build height. I'm lucky I got these bottle of resins in this box and another box, or this would have cost me like 30 bucks. It does turn out cool though. That's the crafting curse, isn't it? Why buy something for $20 when you could spend $50 making it? Here's what it looks like all cured and finished. Well, mostly finished, because I decide the top is a little too boring, and still ponds don't really have like foamy waves. So I decide to texture the top by making clear waves. You can do this in two ways using UV resin. The first way is to add UV to the top where you think waves would be and then cure it quickly so it doesn't flatten out. Or you can do what I did and add wavy resin all over the top just to give it some texture so it looks like a pond on a nice breezy day. And I really like how it turns out. It was definitely the extra step it needed to look awesome. Now you could also do some stuff to the sides, but I like mine plain. It looks kind of foggy on the sides. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I think the next box is called Floating Shakers, which sounds interesting. If I have any cool ideas, I'll definitely make a video on it. But thanks for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye bye!